Chapter 33 was a doozy. We figured out that Alden's mind was broken. Let's see what happens in Chapter 34. No, Della shouted as she ran to Alden's side and shook him. He's still here. He's not some mindless, broken... Alden started twitching and groaning, silencing her argument. Maybe I should try I don't know what that means, but... No, Elwyn snapped, blocking Sophie as she tried to get to Alden. But what if I can help him? I helped Fitz. You didn't help me, Fitz said, trying to sit up and only managing to flail. You'd be lost if it weren't for her, Fitz, Alvar said quietly. But lost is different than broken, Sophie. You're sure my dad is? That's the only reason why Fitz would get pulled under, and why everything in Alden's mind would look wrong. But maybe I should check. No. No one is going to try anything else, Elwyn yelled. He shook his head as he gave Alden another dose of sedative. I don't need any more bodies piling up. Bodies? Della whispered. She glanced from her moaning husband to her trembling son and collapsed. Elwyn sighed as he bent to check her, flashing an orange orb around her face. I think it's time for Della to rest. He looked to Alvar, who blinked like he was coming out of a daze. Yes, whatever you think is best. Elwyn turned Della's chin toward him and poured a sedative down her throat. We should move her, he said as he lifted her limp body and passing her to Alvar. Alvar stared at his unconscious mother, his eyes turning glassy. I guess I'll put her in one of the guest rooms tonight, so she won't wake up and see. Good idea, Elwyn told him, squeezing his arm. Alvar stood there for a few more seconds, like he hadn't quite figured out how to make his legs work. Then he made his way to the door, and for once he didn't blink in and out of sight as he carried Della away. Elwyn handed Fitz a vial of sedative. Your turn. I'm fine. Fitz tried to sit up again, but he was still too weak. I need to talk to Bianna. Sophie stepped forward. I can talk to... You've done enough, Fitz yelled. Sophie was too stunned to move, to think. She barely remembered to breathe as she watched tears stream down Fitz's face. This is not Sophie's fault, Elwyn said, glancing at Sophie as he crouched next to Fitz. It isn't. Fitz snorted. Elwyn sighed. Look, I understand you're angry and in shock, Fitz, but you don't want to say things you're going to regret later. I won't regret them. How about this, then? Elwyn grabbed Fitz's arms. If you don't take that sedative right now, I'm going to pour it down your throat. Fitz glared at him, but he must have realized Elwyn was serious, because he uncorked the vial and swallowed the contents, his shaky hands spilling part of it as he did. Sophie looked away as his head lolled back, reminding herself that Fitz would wake up again. He'd probably still hate her, but he'd be awake, unlike Alden. She glanced at the bed, relieved that Alden had calmed. If she didn't know better, she would think he was just asleep. We can't give up, she decided, digging her imparter from her pocket with shaky hands. She could think of one person who might know how to bring Alden back. People had thought she was dead when she was still alive. Maybe there was still a chance. Alvar decided he should be the one to tell Bianna, and Elwyn needed to stay nearby in case she needed to be sedated, which left Sophie to go open the gates of Everglen. Alone. The midday sun warmed her shoulders as she walked the familiar path, but it couldn't erase the chill that had settled into her heart. The grounds felt darker, emptier without the promise of Alden's smile and deep, accented voice to greet her when she got back. She couldn't imagine a lifetime without him. There had to be something someone could do. Had to. It took her a minute to find the small button hidden on a sundial next to a blue leaf tree, but when she pressed it, the gate swung open, revealing a figure in a black tunic and pants, nervously shuffling his feet. Tiergan! She ran to his side and threw her arms around him. He tensed in her embrace, but she needed something to hold on to. Thank you for coming. Of course, Tiergan patted her back awkwardly. What's going on? You said Alden's sick? She nodded against his chest and then forced herself to let go, wiping her eyes and clearing her throat so she could explain the situation in all its devastating detail. That's impossible, Tiergan said, squinting at the sky. I have to see him. He hurried down the path. Sophie had to run to keep up with him, and they didn't stop until they reached Alden's room. Sophie was sure Tiergan could hear her heart pounding as he pulled open the heavy doors. He sucked in a breath. Sophie did the same. More color had drained away from Alden's skin, turning him pale, lifeless. Tiergan made his way to Alden's side, lifting Alden's arm and letting it fall limply. Is he sedated? He asked Elwyn. For the moment, when he awakes, he gets tremors and babbles to himself. But the sedatives don't last. Elwyn wiped his eyes, and his voice was thick as he asked, Is there anything you could do? It depends. Tiergan's fingers grazed Alden's forehead, settling on his temples. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and jumped back, furiously shaking his head and gripping one of the silver bedposts. I can't, he whispered, swallowing several times as he rubbed his forehead. I'm sorry, his mind is too much chaos. Every tiny hope Sophie had been clinging to slowly unraveled. So he's really broken? Tiergan met her eyes as he nodded. Only once, but it was enough. The room turned to a blur as Sophie's knees collapsed, but something stopped her from crashing onto the floor. Someone's arms, maybe. She couldn't think through the panic and grief swelling inside, clawing up her throat, choking her. Someone shouted something she couldn't understand, and then something cold pressed against her lips. No, she screamed, twisting away. It's not a sedative, Elwyn promised, pressing the vial against her lips again. It's just to help clear your head. Please, Sophie, trust me. She stopped struggling and let him pour the cool, salty medicine down her throat. She gagged, but the liquid stayed down, and as it rushed through her body, the spinning slowed, and the blurry blobs morphed back into faces she could recognize. But the room didn't just become clearer. It became brighter, lighter. Things weren't so bad, really. How could they be when there was this cool rush racing through her, filling her with life and energy and lifting her higher? Whoa, what did you give me? She asked, fighting back a giggle that wanted to burst from her lips as she pulled away, ready to stand on her own again. Something to help your mood. This was more than help. This was weird, unnatural giddiness. Her heart was still broken, but her head was floating and flying, making it impossible to be sad. It's strong, she said, covering her mouth with her hand to hide the smile that had forced its way across her lips. Elwyn ran his hands down his face as he leaned against the bed, staring sadly at Alden. At least one thing's working right. He's really beyond any repair. I can't believe it. He's really beyond any repair. I can't believe it either. Tiergan twisted his fingers so tightly it looked painful. His mind was one of the strongest I've ever seen. Was, not is. And you're sure you can't? Sophie meant to whisper, but her voice came out loud and clear. Positive. Maybe we should call Quinlan, see if he can. There's nothing that can be done for a broken mind, Sophie, Tiergan interrupted. Trust me, I've spent the last 13 years trying. He turned away, walking to the windows and staring out at the sky. Sophie knew he must be thinking about Prentice. Broken, ruined Prentice. Was that Alden's future? A straitjacket in a cell in exile? So that's it? She asked, hating her cheery tone. We just give up? Tiergan nodded sadly. There's nothing else to do except help the family. A sob bubbled up Sophie's chest as she tried to imagine the backers without Alden, but by the time it slipped from her lips, it came out like a squeaky hiccup. She kicked the carpet, scattering flower petals everywhere. Part of her wanted to kick something harder, louder. Hold on, guys. Hi, hun. Mr. Leahy just walked in the door. A sob bubbled up Sophie's chest as she tried to imagine the backers without Alden, but by the time it slipped from her lips, it came out like a squeaky hiccup. She kicked the carpet, scattering flower petals everywhere. Part of her wanted to kick something harder, louder, something that would break into pieces. The other part wanted to giggle and roll in the silky flowers. Stupid, confusing elixir. It just doesn't make sense, she decided. He was fine before he got in the headache. How does someone go from fine to broken in 5 minutes? She could still hear him laughing as she tackled him with a hug. Something must have happened to set it off, Tiergan said quietly. But nothing did. He was just standing there watching the elite prodigies present their stinky flowers and dance, and her voice trailed off as a memory flashed back. Wiley, spinning gracefully in a silver robe. She'd been so worried about seeing him at school that she'd leaned over and asked Alden if he thought... And he said, "No," she whispered as her hand started to her mouth. No. No what, Sophie? What's wrong? She shook her head, feeling her eyes burn. Either Elwyn's happy elixir was wearing off, or the truth was so real and painful it cut through the fake haze. Fitz is right, she whispered. It is my fault. Whoa, what do you think is the connection with Wiley and that spinning graceful thing in his robe, and then what she's saying about no, kids. I have no idea. Let's tune into chapter... I always lose the chapter. What's the next one? 35 to figure it out. Okay, love you. Miss you.